Hello and welcome to episode 94 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR. As always, I am joined by fellow co-founder Evan Silva. And today we have a very special guest. You guys already know him. You already love him. He's gone 0 RB in season long. He's gone robust RB in best ball. He's written all about it already. It is Mike Leone, our master of math. Mike, what's going on?
I'm flexible, Adam. I'll change my RB strategy how I have to. I get yelled at by everybody this way.
Exactly. He's all strategies for RB, which is what we're going to talk about today. Evan, what's going on?
What's up? Hopefully we can get a good strong Leonard Fournette take out of Mike Leone for the people.
God, I can't take this Leonard Fournette thing. It's unbelievable. Okay. This is the second part in our positional strategy series. Today, we're going to talk about how to handle the running back position in kind of standard format, season-long drafts, home league type of stuff this season. Before we get to that running back strategy, I want to remind everyone that our draft kit is just $35, and we have put a ton of work into it. Cheat sheets for every format, Silva's tiers, Silva's top 150, analysis on every player, draft recaps, lots more. And also, if you guys are playing best ball at all, which to me is the best way to get ready for your draft, if you're playing best ball at all, we have a ton of content up on the site for that, best ball and Underdog, DraftKings, wherever else you're playing. Okay, let's get to it. One of the most obvious trends in all of fantasy football this year is the thirst at the running back position. I don't think I've ever really seen anything like it. And if you look at, Underdog ADP, and I like to use real money ADP, which Underdog is obviously, the first 6 picks on Underdog right now in ADP are all running backs. 12 of the first 14 picks are running backs. We'll see 25 running backs come off the board in the first 50 picks in a lot of drafts. Leone, what is going on here? Why the sudden thirst at the running back position among the fantasy football community?
Yeah, the RB thirst is very, very real. I think there's a couple reasons for it. One, you go back to fantasy 10 years ago, the RB thirst, everything was about RBs, and then we had the 0 RB strategy come along and it was successful for a few years, and things changed a little bit, especially as more leagues went to PPR. But what we saw last year, I'm looking at the top half PPR performers. The top 14 guys were all taken in the first few rounds. And I think we just had this outlier year where there weren't a ton of injuries up top. There weren't a ton of busts up top. And when the injuries and busts don't occur, obviously the only way you're going to get an RB1 season is to draft an RB early, and people just don't want to feel left out. And I think it makes sense for the guys that truly deserve it and have these diversified workloads, pretty good athletic profiles. But where you get in danger is when you start seeing sort of this mirage of volume for guys that might not be in the best situations, might be injury prone, where that volume looks good right now but could disappear very quickly, these sort of fragile type guys. And in general, we know bust rates on running back can be high. So I think I understand why it's happening early in round 1 and 2 with some of these guys, but there are definitely guys in rounds 3 and 4 that are going way earlier than they should because of the RB thirst.
Yeah, for sure. And Evan and I, we talked about this, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 months ago. We talked about the running back thirst, and we adjusted all of the rankings and stuff like that to try to give our best strategy and our best ways to combat that when we think about it. But a lot of it's going to come down to player taste because, obviously we think Leonard Fournette in weeks 1 and week 2 and week 3 is probably going to touch the ball 20 times. It doesn't mean he's worth a 3rd round pick. And I hate to keep picking on Lenny. People are sick of us talking about Lenny. But anyways, Evan, what do you think about this whole trend? Do you remember anything like this where running backs are flying off the board so fast in fantasy?
Well, I thought that people were doing it just because the counselor was saying to do it. The counselor's big on the robust RB strategy. Got to get girly in the 2nd round. But truly, I totally agree with what Mike said, and that's that. There are legit probably 14, 15 running backs that are worth drafting in the top 2 rounds. But then what that does is it forces up guys that don't deserve that designation in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rounds, like Fournette, who has just a terrifying floor, and maybe questionable ceiling, especially if Chris Thompson is going to be a factor, which I think that Jay Gruden is planning on Chris Thompson being a factor. But, I think that Devin Singletary, who doesn't have a ton of upside from a touchdown or receiving standpoint, and could lose, quite a bit of work potentially to Zach Moss. He's a guy that gets forced up often in drafts. Le'Veon Bell going in the fourth round he's got a terrifying floor, and I think very questionable ceiling. David Johnson, the same. Todd Gurley and Chris Carson coming off the hip fracture. I've really warmed up to Chris Carson recently, but I mean, there's definitely risk there coming off a hip fracture. Todd Gurley limping around the training camp practice field going in the third and fourth round. Very often the third round, actually. Jonathan Taylor without a secure receiving role. Definitely is going to bust big runs. Also have Marlon Mack and Naheem Hines there to be concerned about. All these guys are getting bumped up. Raheem Mostert consistently goes in the fourth and fifth rounds. And, it looks like a full-blown three-man committee there in San Francisco at this point on a team that's almost certainly not going to run as much as it did last year. And when Raheem Mostert had his 8-game run as the 49ers lead back, he had 13 targets in those 8 games. So I think those are the pitfalls, the high percentage pitfalls at this position that they get forced up because those first and second rounds are so littered with the running back picks, and then people need depth.
Yeah, there are macro trends going on here, right? If you look 5-10 years ago, there were so many more bell cow backs. Like, it would have been insane for there to be so many 60-40 splits and 55-45 splits. Now it's like every team is doing it, and that pushes guys up too, because it's like, well, we know Aaron Jones is only going to get maybe 60-65% of the running back snaps, but he's still worth a second round pick. So how do you think the macro trends change things, Leone? And also another macro trend we talked about in the article that Dink was it's slight, but teams are throwing more and more to their running backs, which I guess, as more people are playing full PPR, pushes them up boards as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and you brought up Aaron Jones, Nick Chubb. I mean, we've got guys that are in splits going in round 2, which seems nuts. And I don't even dislike those guys too much, but I think what you're looking at as far as how the running back position has changed, and you see more of those splits, you really want targets and goal line touches. That's where you're going to make your money. And that's where you're realizing your upside in fantasy football, if you had to just dumb it down as simple as possible. So someone like Nick Chubb and Josh Jacobs in round 2, these guys worry me because I don't know if the targets are going to be there. Someone like Aaron Jones, that TD rate last year, not sustainable, especially if you bring in AJ Dillon and you don't necessarily know what the goal line touch distribution is going to be there. So there are a lot of potential pitfalls. I think Evan and I are more in lockstep at running back than receiver. I can't wait till we fight about receivers, but at running back, I'll give my Leonard Fournette take real quick, since we already brought it up a couple of times, but I get the pro favor argument for Fournette is we don't care about running back efficiency because it's a little bit tough to predict, and we just want guys who are going to see volume. And Fournette's volume was tremendous last year. The concern for me, he never caught passes like he did last year. He was super inefficient catching those passes. They bring in Chris Thompson. I think you could significantly chop off the target expectation for Leonard Fournette. Now, all of a sudden, a third-round price tag doesn't look so good, even with the base volume. And now you're on a team that's not very good, which hurts the touchdown upside, which also I feel like there just creates, guys with a little bit of injury. They might sit these guys. They might want to get younger guys more playing time. So I really see a lot of red flags with Leonard Fournette and this context. This, I think, to me is the microcosm of a really fragile running back that looks good on the surface, but could really totally tank.
Right. Okay. The Fournette hive is going to come after you now, Leone. They're going to move from Silva and they're going to come after Leone now as well. Okay. We talked about how guys are getting pushed up that maybe we don't love that much in the second, third, fourth round, the running back position. And we've talked about it a lot. At some point, you're going to have to take running backs over wide receiver, but it seems insane to take, I don't know, Aaron Jones over Julio Jones or something like that. It seems absolutely insane, but at some point you have to take running backs. However, if you choose to take wide receivers rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, you get into this kind of modified zero RB strategy. And I think that can make sense depending on how RB thirsty your league is. I think ideally for me, if it's possible, I'd love to start Miles Sanders Mixon. I'd love to start, Edwards-Helaire, Kenyon Drake, or something like that. Like, those are things that I would like to start RB, and then I wouldn't feel like I was missing anything at all by going wide receiver heavy ground 3, 4, 5, 6, where it's so strong. I don't think full-blown zero RB in home leagues makes sense. Like, against casual opponents, like my buddies from college, like, it's not the same thing. You know what I mean? Like, I can just value draft them to death because they don't know who the right values are, or it's less likely than someone in like a FFPC 1900 buy-in or something like that, So I can just value them. I don't need this zero RB strategy, but I do think the modified zero RB in competitive leagues makes sense. Evan, I know you've executed that sometimes, and by modified zero RB, I just mean running back in round 1, maybe in round 2, and then just pounding the wide receiver and tight end positions. What do you think about that from an overall perspective at the running back position?
I love it. I think that that's like pretty close to the optimal way that I want to build just a general fantasy team is, I mean, especially if I'm drafting in like, let's say the top 7 and we're calling, obviously McCaffrey the 101 and we're calling, let's say Clyde Edwards-Helaire the 107. If I can start off with that running back anchor, and then I can come back in the second round. Julio Jones goes in the second round every single draft. You get Julio Jones in the second round, or you could take a stud tight end. George Kittle goes in the second round pretty much every draft. Sometimes lasts till the early third. Come back in the third round and take Juju or something like that. Adam Thielen, Calvin Ridley. I mean, you can just start absolutely picking off a ton of high value wide receiver ones in like, for multiple rounds in a row. I think that Amari Cooper is a wide receiver 1, and he consistently goes in the 4th round. Even on down to like the 6th and 7th round, where we know that Will Fuller can score like a wide receiver 1. Michael Gallup is probably the most underdrafted player in all of fantasy right now. He was 6th in the NFL in receiving yards per game last year. He can absolutely score like a wide receiver 1. I mean, you can have one heck of a PPR draft, especially if you're playing in a league with multiple flexes or 3 starting wide receiver spots and then 1 or 2 flexes, just, filling all that up with, guys with wide receiver 1 upside after starting with your running back anchor in the first round. I think that's really almost close to the optimal way to build this year. And then you can piece together your RB2 in the 7th, 8th, 9th with guys that are, not necessarily going to win you your league, but are going to keep you afloat with 11 to 14 touches per game. And you're obviously relying on all your home run hitters, your RB anchor, maybe your stud tight end, and 4 stud receivers to carry you until maybe you can use the waiver wire to upgrade that RB2 slot.
Yeah, Leone, I want you to hit on the point that you made, and Evan just talked about wide receivers a lot, and I know this is the running back episode, but it's important to realize because we love so many wide receivers in rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The problem is you have to take running backs at some point. So tell the people what your take is on that whole situation where you're on the clock and it's like, God, I like the wide receiver more, but I got to take a running back at some point.
I think you have to just remind yourself the macro profiles of like a shaky running back. Might feel good at the time filling in that roster spot, but you don't win the draft because your roster looks good on paper immediately after the draft. You win your draft because you have, a crazy upside team come playoff time. And the best way to do that is to get these receivers who they can't be substituted by volume. If Julio Jones, maybe that's a bad example because Calvin Ridley's there, but if a highly talented wide receiver 1 goes down, the person stepping in doesn't become Julio Jones just because they're seeing that volume. It's more skill dependent. Now, we've seen at running back, the Pittsburgh Steelers the past few years, Le'Veon Bell goes out. Well, all of a sudden, Jalen Samuels is a stud. James Conner is a stud. You can replace that, just by having the workload. So I don't think you want to do something that just makes your roster feel nice at the time. You want to keep in mind the different risk reward profiles of the positions. And if it's a running back we really like James Conner, we're pretty high on. You can get him in round 3. That's fine. But for the most part, in rounds 2 through 5, I'm with Evan. The receivers are just so strong there. You get your stud RB in round 1, and then 2 through 5, you really want to build with some of these really, really strong wide receiver profiles.
Okay, I think another theme of the running back position this year, and Evan and I have talked about it some, is this whole rookie versus veteran thing and other 1A versus 1B situations. For example, Jonathan Taylor versus Marlon Mack, DeAndre Swift versus Kerryon Johnson, Mostert versus Tevin and McKinnon, Mark Ingram versus J.K. Dobbins. Maybe even we could throw Darrell Henderson, Malcolm Brown versus Cam Akers into there, Singletary versus Zach Moss. I think we've done a good job on the pods and in the rankings and the articles of taking these on a case-by-case basis, which I think people should do. But generally speaking, this is what we're talking about when we refer to ambiguous backfields. And guys and our opponents are kind of afraid to take on these ambiguous backfields. And that's why you can get Kerryon Johnson in round 9. That's why you can get J.K. Dobbins or Mark Ingram in round 6 or 7, or Darrell Henderson in round 10, or Zach Moss in round 11. It's an ambiguous situation. People don't see it like they're going to get a league winner, but if you're passing on running backs in those rounds 3, 4, 5, 6, you're often going to end up with decisions on these guys. So Evan, I know you've talked a lot about trying to be a little bit lower on rookies due to the whole COVID no offseason thing. There are certainly some of these veterans that we've talked about that are in good situations. Is that where you're finding a lot of your running backs coming in there in rounds 8, 9, 10, 11?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, and you named a lot of good names. But especially when I'm doing that RB anchor strategy, or the modified zero RB, coming back and just hammering running backs after I've put together my 4 or 5 stud receivers, maybe an elite tight end, and my anchor running back, coming back and hammering those running backs that are in the ambiguous backfields or have a lot of upside if the starter goes down, or might have some standalone value, like a Chase Edmonds. Would be another good name that I add in there. Drafting Boston Scott also could have standalone value. He typically goes like 11, 12. Duke Johnson could have standalone value and is placed on the depth chart behind a running back that has struggled with injuries for years. Just dotting my bench with a ton of running backs that, hey, we get to week 1, we're surprised by a few things every single time in week 1. And we're probably going to be more surprised by what happens in week 1 than usual this year, because there's no preseason games leading into week 1. The reporters have limited access, and so therefore there are going to be surprises that occur in week 1, and kind of preparing for those surprises. I think a good way to do that is stack your bench with backup / RBBC backs. Tevin Coleman is another guy who's really, really cheap in drafts, and he could start week 1. I mean, and he could get 15 carries in week 1. I mean, that really shouldn't surprise anyone.
Yeah. Go ahead, Leone.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about ambiguous backfields and the strategy that Evan laid out, where maybe you take one running back early and take receivers for 4 or 5 rounds. Well, if you're not overthinking the volume week 1, and I talked to Ben Gretsch from CBS about this, and he's really strong on looking at, if you're high on a player long term, maybe don't overthink the volume short term, especially in this season where we think could be a little bit chaotic. So you can get DeAndre Swift in round 6. If like this was a running back that, depending where he got drafted, might have been the 101 in rookie dynasty drafts. And J.K. Dobbins in a spot where he can see a ton of efficiency going 6, 7. And in home leagues, guys like Ronald Jones in ambiguous backfields, they're going in round 8. So a lot of these guys you can get in around 6 to 8. Honestly, the only difference between them and the guys going in rounds 3 through 5 is you feel a little shakier about the volume week 1. But as far as their seasonal outlook, I don't know if it's that much different, especially from an upside perspective. So you're banking the same upside while taking on a lot less risk and having a lot better wide receivers by doing that.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to understand the difference between handcuffs and ambiguous backfield. Like, we know Tony Pollard is a handcuff. We know Alexander Madison is a handcuff. They literally need an injury to be good for you. The other backfields that we just talked about are ambiguous backfields, and I think we should understand the difference between those, because when we're executing these kind of strategies where we need guys to work, ambiguous is going to have a lot more value than handcuff, especially at the beginning of the season. Okay. I want to talk about pass catching backs, because we had some debate in Slack about this, some strict pass catching running backs. And what I mean by that is James White. I mean by that is Tariq Cohen, Duke Johnson, maybe Matt Breida, though I'm not sure exactly what his role will be in Miami. I think, Leone, your opinion is that the market undervalues these strict running back pass catching types. Tell the people if that's true, and if so, why.
It depends where they go. So someone like Tariq Cohen, if you're taking him in rounds 5 and 6, yeah, he's being way overvalued because the upside of a lot of these backs we just talked about in these ambiguous backfields is way higher. But let's say you've only got one running back and the draft breaks wrong and Ronald Jones, DeAndre Swift, J.K. Dobbins, they go before you pick. To get a floor player from the pass catching side of things in a James White or Tariq Cohen in rounds 7 through 10 is phenomenal because that one buys you time for some of these other running back stashes that Evan said you're going to fill your bench with. It buys you time for these guys to work into their roles, to really develop, because you can throw in someone who's going to give you a high floor amount of points each week. And the flip side to that is the upside is actually a little bit higher than we think. I know JJ Zachariason of Number Fire, Kevin Cole of Pro Football Focus, they tried to delve into running back upside where it comes from, and it comes from targets a lot. And some of these guys like James White and Tariq Cohen, it's not like they're going to, no matter what happens in front of them, they're going to become goal line backs or every down back. So the upside's a little limited. But if you're going to see 15% of your team's targets, you have upside. You could just run lucky on efficiency. And even a back like Kareem Hunt, who you're going to have to take a couple rounds earlier, that's sort of the dream in a modified zero running back build where you get the pass catching role from Kareem Hunt right off the bat. But then you also get the elite handcuff upside where if something happens to Chubb, all of a sudden you've got a running back that would go in the top 10 in a draft if we knew Chubb was out.
Evan absolutely hates Tariq Cohen. Eviscerate Mike Leone for his Tariq Cohen take, Evan.
I mean, Tariq Cohen stinks. So if you like to draft bad players, go ahead. But I mean, I completely agree with everything that's just a player take, but what Leone was talking about from a strategy standpoint is completely on point. And James White is a good example. It's a great example of this, really, because there is definitely a scenario where he just dominates snaps in the New England backfield this year. I mean, you get a bunch of, look, I love Rex Burkhead and everything, but he's like a crusty old dude who's like, on his last legs in the NFL. This is probably like, his last season or something. And Damian Harris, I mean, he really didn't do anything to impress last year. Is he going to have any involvement in the passing game? I mean, really, what would his ceiling be like? What Sony Michel was doing? And that's not getting involved in the passing game. Lamar Miller can't get off PUP to start the season. James White is going to be trusted. He's the guy that can play the majority of the Christian McCaffrey role. When we saw Cam Newton, in an offense in 2018 where he was dumping the ball a lot on early downs to running backs, which is a pretty efficient play. So James White, there is more upside there than meets the eye. So I think that he's a perfect example of a guy that you can get in the 30s among running backs in terms of positional rank and use as your RB2 or in one of your flex spots to get you through tough times and might end up being a stud. I mean, he was a stud in, I want to say 2018. I mean, he's had a big season before, and I think he could do it again.
Yeah, it just speaks to how much more valuable a target is than a carry, and we need to think about that even when evaluating the running back position for sure. I think ideally, I personally want to be done with my running backs by like round 10 or round 11, and Kareem has done a lot of work on hit rates for running backs, and it's really, really drops off after round 10 or 11. And I'll name some guys that I think maybe could be viable after that range, but like the carry on and like Zach Moss is really where I want to kind of wrap up my running backs. I don't know if you guys agree or not. And then if there are some guys after that I'm okay with. Like I think DeAndre Washington is a fine flyer. I think AJ Dillon is an okay flyer. Damian Harris, we mentioned already. Jerick McKinnon, Evan and I talked about on the last podcast. But those guys are certainly thinner. Leone, is there like a point where you think, hey, I should have my running backs wrapped up because the flyer hit rates are so much better at quarterback and wide receiver. And by flyer hit rates, I mean after round 12 or so than they are at running back.
Yeah, I mean, this is where you're talking to a zero RB guy who, convinces himself each year that Justice Hill is going to win him his league. So it's a little bit tougher for me to say to be done because sometimes I just, will absolutely pepper the bench with running backs, as many as I can get. But I think you're probably right in a more of a home league type setting. Zach Moss, one of those guys you mentioned, and you talked about this a little bit with the rookie versus vets type thing. targets and touches being upside, right? I think Devin Singletary might have some false volume allure where he might get a ton of touches between the 20s, but he was really inefficient as a receiver. Zach Moss projects to be better as a receiver out of the backfield. They refused to give Devin Singletary goal line carries last year. They gave him to Frank Gore, and Gore was terrible. So those carries are going
Singletary
to go to the bigger
had 2
body.
carries inside the 5 all year,
Nuts.
I think.
Yeah, that's insane. And those carries aren't going to Singletary. They're going to Zach Moss, who's the bigger bodied guy. So to get Zach Moss 6 rounds later than Devin Singletary is wild, when it's not a crazy world where just right from the day one, he has as much value as Devin Singletary. And then if Singletary goes down, you've got to smash. But yeah, round 10s to 11 is when you start losing those guys, like, and I say standalone value, I mean guys that even without an injury in front of them or something, you can start them. You know, maybe it's not an ideal situation, but you can put them in your lineup and be okay. And the reason I think the RB hit rates drop off after that is because these running backs after Kerryon Johnson, Zach Moss, they don't have that standalone value. They might be more like handcuffs where you need an injury to happen in front, or you just really dicey playing time situations. And I'm okay stashing those guys, but in a regular league with waivers and whatnot, you got to be quick to move off those guys and churn that bottom of the roster for whichever flyer, you know, starts to look more positive the next week. You don't want to get too tethered to those guys that you're drafting after rounds 10 or 11.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, I don't want to go into this season starting Zach Moss as my RB2. Ideally, I started, with 2 running backs like Sanders Mixon or something like that I already talked about. Sometimes it's not possible. And certainly guys will drop too. Specifically in home leagues, you can get some guys that we like. Maybe Chris Carson drops to round 5 or James Conner to round 3 or round 4 or something like that. So it can happen where you don't get yourself into these spots. We're talking about situations where it does. Evan, any thoughts on late round flyers at running back? I mentioned some that I like: DeAndre Washington, AJ Dillon, Damian Harris, Chase Edmonds, Jerick McKinnon. Any other running backs come to mind that you think might be available for people around 12 or later?
Yeah, you mentioned McKinnon. I'm just looking at my list. I think that Brian Hill is somewhat intriguing behind limping Todd Gurley at the very, very end.
So you think it's Hill over Ito?
Yeah. Well, I think that the expectation would be a split, but I don't know. I've never been a big fan of Ito, even as an Ito dynasty owner. Justin Jackson, I've been reading like a lot of articles and from beat writers. It sounds like Justin Jackson is going to open the season as the Chargers number 2. I know that you really like Justin Jackson, Adam. Raquel Armstead can't get off the damn COVID list. Divine Ozigbo apparently has been looking. I mean, these are really, really late picks, right? Yeah. But Divine Ozigbo is like a guy, I think that should be owned in dynasty leagues right now behind Leonard Fournette and with Raquel Armstead still on the COVID list. But yeah, I mean, we name pretty much all the guys.
Yeah. Okay. Late round flyers, and I'm working on my late round flyer article, and I think that most of them are typically quarterback, tight end, wide receiver, and not running backs. But we'll see. Maybe some guys will find their names onto the list this year. All right. We've said it all about running backs. We hope that helped you guys heading into your draft, understanding running back strategy and where our head is at relative to how the market is handling running backs this year, which I think is pretty unique. We will be back with wide receiver and tight end strategy sessions. Until then, for Leone, for Silva, for producer Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.